The wind rolled through the valley like an old memory, carrying the chill of the Yukon across a landscape carved by time and toil. Snow clung to the edges of the gravel road as a single truck rumbled toward an old claim site that hadn't seen life in years. The man behind the wheel was silent, his eyes fixed ahead, the same calm determination that once made him one of the most dependable miners in the Klondike. Chris Doumitt was back, not as anyone's right-hand man, not as a helper or a shadow, but as a miner following a whisper older than the gold rush itself. For months, rumors had trickled through the mining camps like river water through silt, whispers that Chris Doumitt had found something buried beneath the permafrost, something worth more than any claim in the modern era. Some said it was luck. Others said he was chasing ghosts. But those who had worked beside him before knew one thing about Chris. He never chased anything without reason. When he returned, it wasn't for fame. It was for unfinished business. The Klondike was a hard land. It rewarded the patient and punished the proud. Every ridge and creek held stories of fortune and failure, and Chris had lived through both. Years of back-breaking seasons had taught him where to look, how to read the dirt, and how to listen when the land spoke. This time, though, he wasn't following geology or test pans. He was following a legend, a tale passed down from old-timers about barrels of raw, untouched gold hidden away when the winter of 1898 froze the richest strike the Yukon had ever seen. Most miners laughed off the story as campfire talk. But Chris had found something that turned the whispers into a map. It started with an old crepe discovered during a side job in Alaska. Inside were relics, tools, weathered journals, and one piece of parchment burned at the edges, its ink faint but still readable. The markings showed a shaft sealed before the turn of the century. The coordinates led straight into forgotten ground deep in the Klondike. Chris stared at that map for a long time, his hands trembling slightly, not from doubt, but from the feeling that this was what all his years of digging had been preparing him for. He didn't announce it. He didn't boast. He simply loaded his gear, packed the map, and drove north. Along the way, began making calls to the few people he still trusted. Miners who had shared hard seasons, who knew what his word was worth. One by one, they answered. They weren't young anymore, and the thought of chasing a myth sounded foolish to some. But when they heard the steady tone in Chris's voice, they felt something they hadn't in years: belief. When the crew gathered at the old camp, there was no big speech, no promises of riches. Chris reached into his pack and pulled out a few rocks he had already tested from the site. Under the glare of the camp light, veins of free gold shimmered through the gravel like threads of sunlight caught in stone. Silence fell. Every man in that room understood what that meant. Legends were one thing, but proof, that changed everything. Within days, heavy machinery rolled into the valley. The sound of engines echoed off the frozen hills as the team broke ground on the coordinates marked by that century-old map. They tore through layers of permafrost, bucket after bucket, until the excavator hit something that refused to move. At first, they thought it was bedrock, but as they cleared the dirt by hand, splintered timbers appeared. Cut, measured, built. Not nature. History. The remains of an old mine shaft emerged from the frozen earth. The air grew heavy, as if the ground itself remembered what lay beneath. They slowed their work, scraping away the dirt until a sealed entrance revealed itself, blackened wood still holding strong after more than 100 years. The crew stepped back, staring at the structure. No one spoke. The weight of time hung thick in the silence. When they finally cracked through the seal, the breath that poured out was cold and stale, like the earth had been holding it in for generations. The deeper they dug, the stronger the feeling grew
that they were unearthing something far greater than a forgotten tunnel. Gravel samples came back heavy, richer than any claim tested in decades. Hope rippled through the camp. For the first time in years, the Klondike hummed with excitement.
Again. But the land wasn't eager to give up its secrets. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. Invisible gases seeped through fissures, choking the air. Supports groaned under pressure. Every foot forward was a wager against collapse. Then one evening, as lanterns flickered and the dig pressed on, one of the crew noticed something carved into a beam near the entrance. Rough letters, barely visible under layers of grime. They brushed it clean and read the words aloud. "Leave or be buried." The phrase cut through the air like ice. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Old miners' tales spoke of curses, of men who vanished protecting their gold. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Chris stepped forward, his face unreadable. He'd heard warnings before, floods, cave-ins, failure, but none of them had ever stopped him. "Danger," he said quietly, "is the guard dog of fortune." The words steadied everyone. If there was risk, it meant they were close. The team reinforced the walls, doubled their precautions, and pushed onward. Each day blurred into the next, long hours, frozen fingers, the steady rhythm of shovels biting earth. The shaft creaked and moaned around them, but they didn't stop. Not after coming this far, not when every test pan glimmered with more promise than the last. Then came the sound that changed everything. A hollow thud from below, followed by a low rumble. The final barrier of rotted timber gave way under their tools, revealing a dark void beyond. Flashlights swept the chamber, cutting through centuries of dust, until beams of light struck something that made every heart stop. A dull, unmistakable glint. The color of destiny. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly as the dust settled. Every man in the tunnel stared in silence. The glint on the far wall was no trick of the light. The reflection danced across the dirt like a living thing. They stepped closer, hearts pounding in their chests, until the shape came into focus. Old barrels, their rims cracked and darkened with age. The closer they moved, the clearer it became that these weren't empty. Gold dust clung to the sides, tiny flakes scattered across the ground as if time itself had been frozen mid-strike. The chamber smelled of earth and history, the air thick with the weight of what had just been uncovered.
One of the men knelt down, brushing away a thin layer of gravel. Beneath it, he saw the unmistakable shimmer of raw gold, so pure it seemed to glow even under the weak light. Nobody spoke. For the first time in days, there were no orders shouted, no machines roaring, just the sound of breathing and disbelief. They had done it. What had been a legend, a story told to pass the time during cold nights, was now lying right before them. Chris stood at the edge of the chamber, his expression calm, but his eyes shining. He had imagined this moment 100 times, but seeing it with his own eyes still didn't feel real. Carefully, they pried one of the barrels open. Inside, gravel and nuggets spilled out like a river of sunlight. The gold caught every bit of light, reflecting it across the walls. It wasn't just dust or flakes, these were solid pieces, chunks of history untouched since 1898. They tested the weight. One barrel alone held enough gold to change a man's life forever. But there were more, half buried under the dirt, sealed tight, waiting. The number of barrels, the richness of each one, it all began to sink in. They weren't just standing in an old tunnel. They were standing in one of the richest finds the modern Klondike had ever seen. Excitement spread through the crew, but so did tension. They all knew what this meant. Word would get out. Nothing stayed secret for long in the Yukon. Rival miners, investors, even the media, they'd all come running. Chris knew that once this discovery went public, the valley would never be the same again. But for now, he wanted his men to have this moment, the quiet before the storm. He let them celebrate, let them touch the gold, let them feel what it meant to win against the odds. By morning, the camp was alive. Machines hummed, generators roared back to life, and the men worked with renewed fire. Each bucket of dirt they lifted seemed to sparkle with promise. But not everyone celebrated. From the ridges above, rival miners watched through binoculars, their faces hard and jealous. Rumors had already started to spread, whispers of a massive discovery, of gold found in sealed barrels deep underground. Some dismissed it as nonsense, but others, the ones who knew Chris Doumitt's reputation, didn't laugh. They knew he wouldn't dig that deep
unless he was sure. A few nights later, the first signs of trouble appeared. A fuel line had been cut. The generator sputtered and died without warning. At first, they thought it was an accident. Then, the next morning, a water hose was sliced clean through. Someone was watching them. Someone wanted them slowed down. The crew grew cautious, taking turns on watch through the night. The sound of boots crunching on gravel replaced laughter around the fire. Every shadow near the claim seemed to move. Chris didn't let fear take over. He'd been through worse. He gathered the crew and told them straight, "If they're trying to stop us, it means they're scared. That means we're close." His calm voice cut through the tension. They fixed what was broken, tightened security, and went back to work. The Yukon was no stranger to competition, but this was different. This was war over buried fortune. Days later, the air inside the mine grew heavy again as they dug deeper into the chamber. More barrels appeared, some crushed under years of weight, others perfectly intact. Every time they opened one, the light bounced off the gold inside, painting their faces in warm shades of yellow. The deeper they went, the more surreal it felt. How had this stayed hidden for over a century? How many had searched for this place and failed? Then something strange happened. As they cleared the final corner of the chamber, one of the men found an old wooden box buried under debris. It was different from the barrels, smaller, hand-carved, sealed tight with metal straps. They pried it open and found old tools, coins, and a folded note sealed in wax. The writing was faded, but still readable. It was from one of the original miners in 1898. It spoke of floods, collapse, and their decision to seal the shaft to protect their gold until they could return, but they never did. The final line read, "For those who find this, take what you must, but remember, the earth never gives without taking something in return." The message sent chills through everyone. For a moment, no one moved. They all felt it, the strange, heavy silence that seemed to fill the chamber. The deeper they dug, the more it felt as if the mine itself was alive, watching. That night, the wind howled through the valley. A storm rolled in, tearing at tents and shaking
loose tarps. In the chaos, one of the excavators malfunctioned and nearly tipped. The crew rushed to stabilize it, working in freezing rain and mud. When dawn came, they found footprints near the equipment, too many to belong to just their own men. Someone had been there. Someone was trying to stop them from taking more. Instead of retreating, Chris pushed harder. He reminded them of the miners who came before, the ones who'd risked everything and never made it home. He told his crew they were finishing that story, giving it the ending it deserved. The men nodded, tired but driven. The legend had become real, and now they were part of it. The sabotage grew worse. One evening, the storage tent caught fire, flames licking through the canvas before they managed to put it out.
Tools were missing, barrels were tampered with. The crew began working in shifts, guarding the site in pairs, rifles slung over their shoulders. The Yukon nights were long, cold, and filled with sounds that made the hair on their necks stand up, but Chris didn't back down. He walked the perimeter every night, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. When asked if he was scared, he simply said, "You can't find gold without a fight." Those words kept the team steady. Every strike of the shovel, every scoop of earth felt like a battle cry against the odds. Then came the breakthrough that silenced everything else. The excavator hit something solid beneath the final layer of dirt. They stopped all machines and began clearing by hand. Slowly an opening appeared, a tunnel leading deeper, carved perfectly straight, like the miners of the past had built it with purpose. The air that drifted out was cold and still, untouched for over 100 years. Chris led the way, lantern in hand, as the crew followed behind. Their lights cut through the darkness, revealing another chamber, larger, deeper, and lined with barrels stacked like a forgotten vault. Gold dust floated in the air like tiny stars. No one spoke. The sound of their breathing echoed off the walls. Chris stepped forward, brushed his hand across one of the barrels, and whispered, "They did it. They really did it." When they cracked open the first one, the truth poured out like a dream. Nuggets, dust, and gravel, gleaming so bright it looked unreal. One of the men hauled a barrel to
Surface and set it on a scale. The numbers climbed higher and higher until they stopped just short of impossible. A single barrel worth millions. They tested another and another. The total was staggering. They had found over $70 million in pure gold, untouched since 1898. The camp erupted in cheers, laughter, and disbelief. Men who had worked their entire lives without luck now stood surrounded by more gold than they could imagine. But through it all, Chris stayed quiet. His eyes lingered on the barrels. His hands rested on the same ground where men long gone had buried their dreams. This was more than a payday. This was history coming alive. He looked at his crew and said, "This one's not just ours. It belongs to every miner who ever chased a dream in this land." His words carried through the valley, strong and steady. The men nodded, some with tears in their eyes. The storm had passed, the danger had faded, and what remained was proof that legends never really die. They just wait for the right hands to uncover them. By the next morning, word had spread through the valley like wildfire. A few miners from nearby claims came wandering in, pretending to be friendly, but their eyes told the truth. They weren't there to congratulate anyone. They wanted to see it with their own eyes. The gold, the barrels, the proof that the legend was real. Chris didn't stop them. He knew the moment they left, the news would travel faster than the wind. By sundown, it already had. Radios buzzed with talk of a secret discovery in the Klondike, a forgotten shaft that had turned into a modern-day treasure vault. Soon, the peace of the valley was gone. Helicopters began to circle overhead. Trucks and camera crews arrived, their lights cutting through the early morning fog. Reporters called it the greatest gold discovery of the century. Investors and mining companies sent offers so high they sounded unreal. The Klondike, which had been quiet for years, suddenly came alive again. Abandoned claims that no one cared about for decades were suddenly worth fortunes. Old machines were dragged out from under snow and started up again. The sound of engines, drills, and shouting filled the air. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. Chris's find had reignited the gold fever that had once defined the Yukon. Men who had left years ago came back, driven by that same old dream, the dream that maybe, just maybe, they could strike it rich. Chris watched all of it quietly. Reporters begged for interviews, but he turned them down. He wasn't interested in fame. He had spent too many years working in silence under the weight of other people's names. Now he finally stood in his own light, and he didn't want noise to drown it out. Instead, he focused on securing the claim and protecting what they had found. The deeper chamber still held gold,
and every ounce needed to be handled carefully. The government sent inspectors to verify the find. Historians arrived too, drawn by the story of the miners from 1898 who had hidden their gold and never returned. They studied the carvings, the barrels, and the tools left behind. Everything matched the old journals from that era, records of men who had struck it big just before a deadly flood swept through. They had sealed their fortune underground, planning to come back when the ground thawed, but history had buried them instead. The find didn't just make history, it corrected it. Those old miners weren't just dreamers who disappeared into the snow. They had been right. They had found the richest strike in the Klondike. They just never lived to claim it. Chris had done what they couldn't. He had brought their story back to life. As the gold was hauled out barrel by barrel, the numbers grew beyond imagination. $70 million. Every man in the crew became a millionaire overnight, but not one of them left the site. They stayed because it wasn't about money anymore. It was about finishing the story they had started together. Rival miners tried to buy their way in, offering shares, equipment, and manpower. Some tried more aggressive ways. A few nights the guards heard the sound of footsteps and engines in the distance. Unknown trucks parked near the claim line, men whispering in the dark. The crew stood watch with rifles at their sides. This time the fight wasn't underground, it was against greed itself. One evening, Chris sat near the fire, staring into the flames. The men were laughing, celebrating another day's haul. But Chris's mind was elsewhere. He thought about all the years he'd worked as someone else's right-hand man, following orders, fixing problems, never getting credit. He thought about every winter spent away from home, every season of failure, every ounce of doubt that had ever been thrown at him. Now, all of it was behind him. He had done what few men ever could. He had turned a legend into reality. A few reporters finally caught up with him at the edge of camp. One of them asked, "What does it feel like to find $70 million in gold?" Chris smiled a little and said, "It's not about the number. It's about proving that it was still there, that the story was true." His answer spread as quickly as the discovery itself. People admired him not just for what he found, but for what he represented. He became a symbol of persistence, of faith, of never giving up even when everyone else had walked away. As weeks passed, the once quiet valley transformed into a frenzy of activity. Companies moved in to stake new claims. Helicopters ferried in supplies. Journalists camped near the riverbanks, hoping for a glimpse of the man who had brought the Klondike back to life. Every bar, every diner, every radio station in the Yukon buzzed with the same name, Chris Doumitt. But fame was never what he wanted. He stayed focused on the work, determined to document the site properly, to make sure the world understood that this was not just a lucky find. It was the result of patience, research, and respect for the land. He even insisted that part of the gold be displayed in a local museum, along with the tools and notes of the original miners. To him, the gold didn't belong to one man, it belonged to history. The local government soon declared the site a heritage landmark. The discovery would be preserved for generations. Tourists began to arrive, eager to stand near the place where $70 million in buried gold had been found. For the first time in decades, the Yukon was back on the world map, not as a forgotten region of the old gold rush, but as a living, breathing